everybody, welcome back once again. Today we are going to start talking about classical Greece, and again, as I have here, this is the one you all pretty much know something about, so let's get right into it. You want to know about Sparta, you want to know about Athens. Why? Because they're the two biggest city-states, they're the two most powerful city-states, and not that there weren't more important city-states, but let's just get right into them because they really show the gambit really of the different types of government and how people looked at things. So Sparta, it just absolutely, it's intense. Sparta, around the year 500 BCE, as you see down here, was able to control this area of Greece that the mouse is circling. That is called the Peloponnesus. And Sparta itself was a city-state, just like the rest of them. It was an interesting city-state. It was led by two kings that kind of shared power, and if they ever fought, one would go and one would stay. They also had a council of ephors that helped them run everything. Now, the thing that they had to run were all their slaves. What the Spartans did is when they conquered the Peloponnesus, they enslaved everybody else that was on that peninsula. And so also by the year 500, they were outnumbered by their slaves 10 to 1. Now, 10 to 1 is a lot. 10,000 to 1,000, 100,000 to 10,000, you can see it's a significant amount of people. And so their society became very interesting. One, it became very austere. There was no wealth, there was no flaunting things. Everybody was kind of equal because they had to be banded together just in case the slaves got any ideas. Their economic system, they were self-sufficient. They really didn't even have money. I mean, they traded money in like iron. No gold, no silver. They had slave craftsmen produce all their goods. They had slave labor produce all their food. They would then go military, and that was pretty much it. So not necessarily the most fun place. What Sparta was really all about was the military, and it was intense. I mean, you went through your first test when you were born. If you were a Spartan child, whether you were a boy or a girl, if you were considered deformed or a little too small or someone that would not grow and be healthy and strong, they killed you. Okay, they left you out on a rock to die. If you were lucky enough to live when you were a boy, your education was all military. You were taken from your mother and your father when you were 7 years old and sent to the equivalent of military school. All of the discipline was violent. You were beaten for everything, and it made them tough. That went to about when they were 18 years old, when at the age of 18, after all their training, they were then shunned and they had to live for a year on their own. And then their final goal was they had to kill one of their slaves without being caught by the other slaves. So they had to be smart soldiers, they had to be strong soldiers, they had to be disciplined soldiers. But as you can see, brutal. Their role in society, really, they were to be soldiers. They would live in barracks from the ages of 20 to 35. When they were 35, they could move home, but they were still part of the military until they were 60, and that's what these guys did. It really is unbelievable. Women, on the other hand, very interestingly, actually had a lot of rights in Sparta. Now, first and foremost, don't get a lot of rights mean they were in charge of, like, the government. They weren't. Their primary job was to have strong boys. That's what they were supposed to do. However, as you can see by the picture on the right, they get a little bit of training, okay, for instance, in the bow and whatnot. They would not get trained in this item right here. This item, as the mouse is going up and down, this is called a dory. This is the Spartan mode of fighting. They used spears. They really did not use swords. They used spears, and they were highly effective with them. But women, because the men were always doing military things, they actually controlled some of the property. We think as much as 1/3 of the property in Sparta was controlled by women. They ran the household, and they were the ones that actually upheld the discipline and the culture. They were the ones that challenged their sons when they were young to be big and strong and muscular, and they were just absolutely incredible. And, they had the famous phrase that all Spartan women had to know, which they told their husbands that when they went off to battle to come back holding your shield or on it, which was a way of them saying that you come back winning a battle or you come back dead. So not necessarily a place I think we would all do well in. Let's contrast that with our friends at Athens. Athens giving having a lot of credit for things, but first and foremost, we have to understand that Athens was in a great place geographically. As you can see by the map, Athens is actually not on the coast, but it has access to the coast. Now you're going to see Athens going to be all about their navy and some certain things that they can achieve, but what you're also going to see is that the Athenians were um, very smart in that they built a huge wall that surrounded their city, their harbor down here, and the whole way. This is actually like a canal. So they had access to the sea. They could not actually be attacked, if you will, because of the land where they were at, and then they had massive protection. So this was a really strong city for a lot of time. Now, of course, with Athens, I have to give you the obligatory picture of the Parthenon. It's awesome. Moving on. They had an interesting government. They had a government that was based on citizenship. And if you were a citizen, you got to take part and be involved in the government. Except as Athens was developing in the 5 and the 600s BCE, there was a problem. And the problem was that only male property owners were considered citizens. So you had a lot of men that really didn't get an opportunity to um, get involved in the government. And also, you could, if you got in trouble, become enslaved if you went into debt. So not only did the wealthy control the government, they could also enslave people by buying up their debts. And at one point, they were really on the verge of a civil war. And that was until the year, right around the year 500, that a man by the name of Solon comes into play. Solon was a great Athenian leader who was able to create a compromise and really help Athens get to the point where they could survive. And this is what they did is they said, okay, landowners, you get to keep your land and you still get to be involved in the government. However, we're going to get rid of debt slavery and we're going to clear everybody else's debt. If you want to take part in the government, all you basically at this point have to do is a male that has enough money that you can take the time, or like you have a job, that you can take the time and serve in the government. What they'll do after Solon in his kind of in his honor is they'll eventually make the government positions paid so that anyone of any skill that wants to serve can get an opportunity. And this is how democracy forms in Athens. It was very, very interesting in that all citizens take part of the government. They vote on policy. They vote on their leaders. They would come together in, again, the assembly. And what was really important was that status in Athens was measured by what you did for your city. And probably the most famous of these men was a guy by the name of Pericles. Pericles was really the hallmark guy from the year 461 to 429 who showed people that if you build public buildings like the Parthenon and temples and economic centers, feeding the poor, supporting things like literature, education, and sports, that Athens could grow and be strong, and it was. And we'll talk a lot about the literature and stuff later, but Athens became one of the hallmarks of the ancient world known for its democracy. Now, there are some exceptions. Women, shocker, no rights at all. Women actually were basically considered property in ancient Athens, and slavery was fairly rampant. And that developed because the Greeks viewed anyone that wasn't Greek as a barbarian, and that's where, if you remember from John Green, they called them barbarians because they felt their language was uncouth, so it made them sound like they were just saying bar, 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 so they called them barbarians. So Athens will achieve some incredible things, but still, if you're a woman or a slave, life was pretty rough. And here's a picture of the Athenian assembly and what that would have looked like. Now, what was crucial for the Greeks and what they really did is they colonized pretty much the entire Mediterranean. If you see the areas kind of in orange here, this is where the Greeks settled to. They found many cities that are still there today. Many of the great cities of the ancient world, like Ephesus and Cyrene over here, Syracuse. And then in the future, some of their cities are important, like Marseille, which is an important port in France, Neapolis, which is actually now modern day Naples, as well, of course, Athens and Corinth and Sparta. Um, the modern day city of Byzantium, which of course was then made into a capital by Constantine. So the Greeks go everywhere, they build cities, and even though still most of the population lives in the country as farmers, this is one of your most urban civilizations in the ancient world of people living in cities, and that's because they built it. Probably the biggest event was the Persian Wars. I'm not going to go over all of this again. We know that the Persians invaded twice in 492 and then in 480, that the Greeks won both times, and it really came down to better tactics. On the top right here where the mouse is at, you see the Spartan phalanx. Them with the dories and their spears were basically an unstoppable force that the Persians did not know how to deal with. And then the Athenians invented this ship here called the trireme, which had 3 levels of oarsmen. It could move incredibly fast. And on the front here, it had this ram where they could basically just crush any ship, sink it, and they came to dominate. Now, once they beat the Persians, the Athenians realized that they were in a position to now dominate the world, if you will. They were very strong in the water, so they decided to create a league called the Delian League. Athens was concerned that the Persians might come back, and so what they did, if you see all of these areas in green, these are all different city-states and their land. What they did is they formed this alliance that they would work together in times of stress, or if the Germans, if the Persians come back. Now, what eventually happened was that instead of everybody working together, the Athenians ended up just dominating all of them, making them pay tribute every single year, that if you don't, we are going to attack you, or we will put you where you guys can't survive, and we'll cut off all your trade. And so in the end, they do end up having an empire. The Spartans don't like it. They don't like the Athenians, and what the Spartans end up doing is forming their own empire called the Peloponnesian League. So you have the areas that they control and a couple of these other cities, and not surprisingly, they end up fighting. And this results in what is known as the Peloponnesian War that lasted from 431 to 404 BC. Basically, it's Athens and their allies, or the Delian League, and Sparta and their allies, and the Peloponnesian League. It actually started when Corinth, who was an ally of Sparta, got into a fight with an Athenian ally, and then just boom, everybody went to war. Early on, there was a stalemate. Athens can't be beat in the water. Spartans can't be beat on land. Eventually, the Spartans will surround Athens, and Athens gets hit with the plague, which puts them in tremendous trouble. They're really on the verge of collapse. Their great leader Pericles is killed, so they decide to go on the offensive with this guy by the name of Alcibiades, who's right there, who attacks a Spartan ally hundreds of miles away on the island of Syracuse. He gets completely whacked. He comes back to Athens, and the Athenians are just out of, really out of time. As you see on the picture on the right, everybody's dying because of this plague. Athens falls. And then when Athens falls, another city takes its place called Thebes, and they're able to kind of push away the Spartans. But the problem is everybody then just kind of goes home, but they exhausted themselves so much that then that allows Philip II of Macedon to eventually conquer them. and we'll talk about him later, about 80 years after this. So in the end, even though they couldn't unite from an outside force and defeat the Persians, the fact of the matter is these city-states were so different and had so many disagreements that in the end, they just ended up self-destructing. However, what Greece was really known for was trade, and we talk about it. How important trade is. It allows them to grow, it allows them to expand their power, and in the end, as you can see here, the Greeks just went everywhere, all the way up to Britain, as you can see, and they got tin from up here, and you got silver, and all sorts of goods was being traded back and forth. Olive oil and wine were really what the Greeks sold, and maybe some tomatoes. From Egypt, Sicily, and southern Russia, now they're involved. They're bringing in grain. Spain and the Black Sea, they're going to provide fish or salted fish. They're going to get metal from Anatolia, which is over here, gold and tin, or modern day Turkey. And then, of course, you're going to also have the slave trade, which is going to be huge. You had chattel slavery, which I'll get into in a minute, but everything got traded back and forth between these colonies, which, as you can see, it made them tremendous amounts of money. These are all different kind of Greek coins that existed, and we find these Greek coins basically from Britain all the way down to Egypt and the Holy Land. And what was very interesting is as a result of this, we are going to get some changes. You will get merchant fleets, or these individuals that will buy lots of ships so that they can go out and make money with them, which is pretty incredible. You are going to see merchants start to grow. So, which we talked about this before, that you get a change in the social order because people just have so much wealth, you can't ignore them. You will have the creation of banks that will actually give loans for people to buy ships and go out on expeditions. Now, unfortunately, there's no such thing as insurance and things along that line. Basically, is they'll get a loan from a bank, and then they will have to pay the bank back a certain percentage of their profits. But we still have early banking, which of course is going to be the foundation to a lot of economic systems today. You will get people who will be mass cultivators. You'll get the development really of what we call almost like your plantation system that let's grow a lot of crops just to sell. And then you'll also get people that manufacture goods. And we all know a manufactured good costs more than a raw good. And what you end up getting here is that the Greeks will now identify themselves as Greek. No matter where you lived, if you spoke Greek and dressed like Greeks and read Greek words, you are a Greek. And Greek becomes the language. It was even the language during the Roman system and then through Alexander. So you're going to go in the Mediterranean basin. If you wanted to look at the language of ideas and things along that line, it was all Greek. They will spread their religion, they will spread their art and literature. And of course, probably one of the greatest examples of Greek unity was the development of the Olympic Games. And I have here a bunch of pieces of pottery that show the different sports. You have racing, you have the long jump, you have the discus and the javelin, you have boxing up here, there was wrestling. Shockingly enough, only men could compete. Sorry, ladies, once again. But this started in 776 BCE, and people did it for the glory of their polis. And if there was a war or a conflict, it would stop, that everybody came together in peace to observe these games. And so this identity of being Greek was very strong. And if you actually look at it today, the Greeks are very, very unified. If you look at people of Greek descent that move out, they often live in similar communities, that they work together. All of this goes back, a good 2,500 years. Unfortunately, it was strictly patriarchal. The males ruled everything. Even they determined who their children to marry. They would also determine to keep any infants. Actually, infanticide was not uncommon. If the father didn't want a daughter and a daughter was born, she would be killed. Women didn't go out much. If they did, they had chaperones and wore veils. Interesting. We just think it's the Muslims, and we want to trash them for that, which we'll talk more about Islamic faith later. But hey, that goes back to the Greeks. Okay, they weren't allowed to mix with other families. Some women could get educated, very rare. They worked at home. Um, Really, the only thing women could do, they could be priestesses. Now, if they were priestesses, they were honored and you couldn't touch them. If you actually were a male that so much as touched a woman priestess, you could be killed for it. But in general, not a lot was going on. There are some exceptions to the rule, and probably the most incredible was this woman you see here, the great lyric poet Sappho, who actually opened up a school for women and art, um, for women who wanted to do art and literature. Um, she unfortunately was then charged with being a lesbian or a homosexual, which, very interestingly enough, male homosexuality was accepted in ancient Greece, female homosexuality was not, and there's evidence that she was actually executed for this. So, once again, an incredible woman, an incredible writer, but the situation really kept her unable from having any success. And of course, you had a lot of slavery. Slavery was very common, it was kind of the norm. Most slaves did not really get any opportunities to kind of do anything in life. But here you really have, for the first time in history, the development of chattel slavery. First, you had the debt slaves, then you had prisoners of war. Now, what you have are that Greeks in the Black Sea would capture people called the Scythians, who were kind of nomadic Russians, and then they would sell them abroad. This is why the Russians and other people are often referred to as the Slavs, because that's the word for slave. Egypt also will develop a slave trade, and they would invade Nubia and capture people and then sell them abroad. There were regulations, but they were basically treated like livestock. Um, you had to treat them really however as you wanted to. Some slaves would be made into tutors, but basically the regulations was that slaves had to be bought and sold at certain marketplaces. And so when we look at classical Greece as a whole, we see the positives and negatives. We'll talk about their incredible culture, their learning, their mathematics, and their architecture. But at the same time, you had the oppression of women and the development, really, of the world's first chattel slavery. So you see a little bit of everything here, guys, and we'll talk about it more in class. So make sure that you get your questions done and your comment, and I will see you tomorrow.